Welcome and hello to everyone who's coming in. I'll give it a minute as people get connected, get their audio going. Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm Paul North. For those of you who've been at these, you'll know that this is a series at the Whitney Humanities Center called The Value of Marx's Capital. They're the Franke Lectures in the Humanities, and they are made possible by the generosity of Richard and Barbara Franke. The lectures are intended to present important topics in the humanities to a wide and general audience, and we usually have had it. So I appreciate everyone who's been sticking with us and who's come back. I'll thank again Alice Kaplan, the director of the Whitney Humanities Center, Sandra Malan Bowles, and Leona Hirschfeld-Kroen for organizing, and Audrey Leek for teching us out. Those of you who've been here know that the workshop will run with a presentation first and then questions. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions and you can put them in the chat once we get to the end. That just keeps us from losing them up the chat. Once you do that, we'll go through them in the order that they get in there, and we'll open up your mics so that you can ask your questions. If you don't want to ask the question and you'd like me to, just note that in the chat. I start usually with a quote from the author and scholar who's visiting us. This is a quote from chapter 7 of Marx's Inferno. This is a rousing passage that gets my Republican mind going. Quote, "The precise institutional arrangements that will best suit any particular group of free and associated laborers will necessarily have to take into account the particularities of their situation, their common resources, their characters and histories and interrelations. The people best placed to know those particularities will be those free and associated laborers themselves. Anyone who presumes to say from afar how they ought to manage their common affairs might rightly expect to be told to mind their own business. The solutions to each association's problems will have to emerge out of the context of the problems themselves, and the institutions of freely associated people are their own affair, provided that no one is dominated." This is a really exciting passage from Marx's Inferno. I'm going to turn over the mic to my colleague, Paul Reiter, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. And thanks also to Will Clare Roberts for being here. Will, it's a real pleasure to introduce you and to be able to interact with you over Zoom. Will is an associate professor of political science at McGill University, and he is a person of broad-ranging interests. He's worked on such topics as BDS and political theory, but his main work to date is the book Marx's Inferno, which I imagine many of you know. It was very widely reviewed when it came out. It was reviewed in Jacobin by none other than David Harvey. It was reviewed also in The Nation and a number of academic journals. And it was the winner also of the Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize in 2017. The book makes a number of bold arguments, one having to do with Marx's use of Dante's Inferno, hence the title, as a kind of structuring template in the book. Another having to do with the idea that capital offers a political theory. And sometimes in some of the reviews, you can see that these are treated as separate undertakings in one book, when in fact, at least in my reading, they're intimately related, connected by, among other things, Will's interest in the language of capital and how the language of capital relates to the language of Marx's context. And that aspect of the book I find very exciting and have learned a lot from it. Will, let me just add, in closing this introduction, is also an incredibly generous colleague who has been sharing his intimate knowledge of the French edition of Capital with us, Paul and me, as we pursue this edition project. And we're very grateful to him for that, and glad that he's part of the project as well. And so, yeah, please join me in welcoming Clare Roberts to our series here. As Paul likes to say, at this point, there would be thunderous applause, but it's Zoom, so Will, you can just jump in.
Great. Thank you, Paul, for that warm introduction. Thanks to both of you, Pauls, for this opportunity to speak both with the seminar students, and sort of thanks to the via negativa of modern catastrophe and the technology by which we cope with it, to this much wider audience. And beyond the specific gratitude that I feel for this opportunity, I also do feel a much deeper debt to Paul and Paul, because they are undertaking this, which is, I think, a true service to the scholarly community, bringing out a new translation, new edition of Capital, the first translation into English in nearly 50 years, and it's sorely needed. I'm going to have the pleasure of teaching the manuscript translation in a seminar of my own at McGill beginning in January, and I'm very excited and grateful to be able to do so. As Althusser joined us, it's important to be, to read and reread Capital to the word, and from beginning to end. And that brings me to the substance of my comments for the evening, from beginning to end. I'm going to start with a moment of disagreement, or of difference at least. Something that divides me from some of the illustrious colleagues who have already spoken with you so far this term. For many of them, as for Michael Heinrich, for example, this is a quote from Michael, Marx's legacy is not a finished work, but rather a research program. And my perspective is not contradictory, but is different. I certainly do not want to deny that Capital represents an open and ongoing research program. It certainly does. However, I also think that it is important to treat Volume 1, which was published by Marx 3 times, in 1867, again in 1872 in a revised edition, and finally in the French translation of 1872 to 1875. I think it's important to treat it as a book. So what's a book? As I teach Platonic dialogues all the time, and so I know from Socrates that what is questions are very, very hard to answer. But I do think we can agree that books have certain characteristics. Books have a beginning and an end. They have structure, they have shape. There's something finished, completed, done. It's sent off into the public. It's published. And when it's published, it exists then as a standalone object, something to be encountered and read as it is in whatever context it happens to land. Shortly before Ben Fowkes published his translation of Volume 1, French theory, in part in reaction against technocrats of the right and left, in part trying to put an affirmative face on the out-of-control processes of power and revolt that swept them along, declared the death of the author. Unfortunately, I think what we've ended up with instead might be the death of the book. Take, for instance, the really gruesome children's author, J.K. Rowling. When she wishes to indicate that one of her major characters in her major work is in fact a gay man, she did not do anything so crass or basic as include a description of or allusion to that fact in her books. Rather, she just went on writing her books however she pleased, and merely declared after the fact and in the media that this particular character is gay. Nothing you might read in the books could possibly tell you this. Only the author's extramural declaration makes it so. And that seems to me to be an author declaring the sort of the death of her own book, right? They are never finished. The words on the page are in the final analysis completely irrelevant to their interpretation. Like, that case is absurd, obviously, and so is the author. But the history of Marxism is not as unfamiliar as I would like with the Rowling school of textual interpretation. The key to what Marx's works, Marx's published words often mean is sometimes supposed to be nowhere in his published works, nowhere in his pamphlets, nowhere in his books, nowhere in his articles. No published word is final, since an interpreter can declare what it should mean on the basis of something else. One of Marx's letters or notebooks, something written by another author completely, oftentimes a current political exigency or the most recent economic crisis, etc. I think it's important, therefore, to read Volume 1 as a book, because I think it's important to treat it as something done. I think it's important to treat it as something that can be deciphered and explained at the level of the word, at the level of word choice, sentence construction, concrete references, the transition from one thought to the next. It matters for my purposes that Marx never finished volumes 2 or 3. He never tried to publish the Grundrisse, but he published volume 1 3 times in 2 languages. And those 3 versions of the book were finished products. They have beginnings and ends, and they can be figured out. And they can be read and interpreted, therefore, I think, without any reference. I'm not saying that this is the only way that they can be read and interpreted, but they can be read and interpreted without any reference to anything else Marx wrote, because that's what publishing a book means. It means putting something into the hands of readers who may know nothing else about you and trusting that they can figure out what's going on. So that's the perspective that I'm approaching the book from. Now, on the other hand, if you do know me from my book, if you're familiar with my book, you might be thinking to yourself, wait, aren't you the guy who claims the key to the structure of Volume 1 is Dante's Inferno, and the key to its argument is Marx's disagreement with Proudhon? Like, which fair. But I have a couple rejoinders. First, I want to say something about what I take to be the political purpose and rhetoric of capital. And then I want to turn to its structure and in particular to its relation to science. And that means, in this case, its relationship to political economy. So David Harvey gave a series of lectures last year at the People's Forum, and they're all up on YouTube, in which he sort of reprises his famous class lectures, reading Capital. And he starts those lectures off by talking about the wealth of allusions and metaphors and other literary elements in Capital. And then he says, basically, well, yes, there's all of this wonderful literary stuff in there, but at the center of the book is a certain structure of argument. I think this is a tried and true approach to reading Marx. It's shared by analytical philosophers and radical geographers alike. And what it assumes is that capital can be at least analytically separated into its argumentative structure on the one hand, and its literary references on the other. And I've never really shared this perspective. So another reference. So in the June 17, 1883 issue of La Bataille, which was the radical Parisian newspaper that was edited by Marx's almost son-in-law, Prosper Olivier Le Cigarette, there's a little ad for a radical workers' bookstore. And it trumpets its selection of socialist Republican propaganda. And it lists, alongside Guest's Catechisme Socialiste and Arnaud's Histoire parlementaire de la Commune, and Malon's La Quintessence du Socialisme. It also lists Le Capital by Karl Marx, 5 francs. I think that little ad is actually a truer key to understanding capital than any hermeneutic that tries to isolate the propositional content and structure of Marx's argument from its literary form and references. If you say to a crowd, expropriate the expropriators, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to try to separate out the argumentative structure from the literary references in that claim. In the following sense, the argument of that claim is constituted by the allusions and metaphors of the statement. Expropriation is a Roman legal concept, justifying the seizure of property by the public authorities for the common good. The redoubling of the term implies not only that we should seize property, and not only that we should do so for the common good, but that the current proprietors also seized it from others themselves. And I think that's the most interesting part, and that they seized it for the common good, or at least they thought they were, or they could represent themselves as having done so, or they could plausibly justify themselves in this way. You can explain and explicate, I think, all of this. And it absolutely has an argumentative structure. But the original statement remains essentially an effort to propagate a political analysis and course of action, which simply does not make any sense outside of its references to Roman law and its imperative form of address. And I think that's true of capital as well, as a whole. And this is why radical booksellers would see it as a book of socialist Republican propaganda, right? Reading Capital as a book, therefore, for me, does not mean treating it as sort of hermetically sealed off from the world. It doesn't mean that it's locked up in its internal relations. Rather, it means, for me, treating it as an intervention in the world, referring constantly to other books, to other texts, to other discourses. And incidentally, this is also why I'm a little more bullish on the French edition than, say, Michael Heinrich is. He made a couple of references to his criticisms of the French translation when he was giving his talk a couple weeks ago. I think that a lot of those reservations hinge on, claims in Marx's letters, and that I think there's no reason to doubt necessarily, but that, Marx really tried to simplify and popularize, especially the first couple chapters for the French edition. And I think that there are reasons to, because of that, I think that, Heinrich has good reasons to look also at the second German edition and at the appendix to the first German edition. But I also think that Marx's persistent efforts to popularize and simplify capital, that is, to give it a form of expression that's suited to uptake and propagation amongst militant proletarians, need not be thought of, at least simply, as like watering down truths that the proper expression of which is exacting, precise, and a bit esoteric. Okay? So therefore, my emphasis on Volume 1's status as a book goes hand in hand with my insistence, which I picked up at least in part from Terrell Carver, who gave a talk earlier as well, that this is a political intervention, right? That capital is an address to the workers' movement and an attempt to propagate socialist republicanism. So that's the first thing I sort of wanted to say. On the other hand, I think the presumption that as readers, and now I want to talk more about this relationship to science and structure. I think the presumption that as readers that we should try to separate out Marx's arguments from its literary trappings. I think that's related to and in part draws its strength from another presumption, a very old one, that capital is a work of science and a critique of ideology. A recent essay by Frank Ruda that you may run into unpacks that presupposition. I think it's a fun little essay, but it unpacks that presupposition with considerable originality by reading Marx's ideology critique as an inheritor of Plato's image of the cave, right? And he aligns that with, but then also says it requires supplementation by Hegel's science of spirit. I don't think everyone is so extravagant in their elaborations on that theme of ideology critique, but I think Ruda's explorations are entirely consistent with a broad swath of Marxist discourse. And to discuss this swath of discourse more broadly, I'm going to have to mention Dante. So one of the claims I make in my book is that in Capital, Marx casts himself as a Virgil to the proletariat, by which I mean he guides the workers through the hell of political economy. But in the time since I've written that, and having been questioned many times about and pushed on my use of Dante, I've realized that thinking structurally, it would be more accurate and precise to say that Virgil is to Dante's Inferno as political economy is to Marx's Capital. So in his Inferno, basically, I think one way of reading Dante's Inferno is to just say Dante is here narrating for us his own reading of Virgil's Aeneid. So Dante is lost and confused in the middle of his life. He turns to Virgil's poem, and he finds there a sort of indirect path to recovering his Christian faith. And he was able to do this because Virgil showed Dante basically the depths of human depravity. He showed him human cruelty and stupidity, and Virgil claimed to know how to navigate those depths. And there are some things that I think Virgil claims in the Aeneid, or seems to lots of its readers. He claims that wickedness is its own punishment, for example, that virtue is its own reward, and that nature is sufficient unto itself, and therefore perfect. These were teachings that Virgil himself had probably picked up, at least in part, from Lucretius, whose De Rerum Natura Virgil considered to be the greatest work of human poetry. So this is the perverse cruelty of Dante. So where in his moral cosmos does Dante put his teacher Virgil, his teacher Lucretius, and all the other followers of Epicurus? Well, he puts them deep in the bowels of hell, right? His Inferno could be subtitled The Critique of Virgil, because it shows him learning from, but also going beyond Virgil. And it shows him subjecting all of classical antiquity, all of the classical antiquity that Virgil epitomizes, to a damning criticism that this classical antiquity, and Epicureanism in particular, has no faith in or insight into the sources of the nature that it claims to understand. I think that's basically the role that political economy plays for Marx. Marx narrates for us in Capital his own reading of this bourgeois science, right? And he asks his readers to follow along. And just as Virgil both claims to know the path through Hades and is yet condemned to reside in a hell that he can't fully comprehend, so also political economy claims to know how the production and distribution of wealth works, but it's also prisoner of a capitalist mode of production that it barely fathoms. And if this is the right way to think about the relationship between political economy and capital, and this is, for me, what's at stake in reading Capital as Marx's Inferno, then I think several important consequences follow. First of all, capital is not, I think, part of the tradition of ideology critique, at least as that tradition is usually understood. In fact, I would go even further. I would say it's not even part of the history of critical theory if we accept someone like Raymond Geuss's reconstruction of that tradition as in the claim that critical theories aim at producing enlightenment, that is, knowledge of one's true interests by emancipating agents from ideology. I don't think that's what capital is trying to do at all. Instead, I think capital is part of a much less appreciated tradition, that of political critiques of science. I think for Marx, state-of-the-art social science, political economy, can show us the interconnections of the world we live in. It can teach us how this present social order hangs together, but it cannot tell us how to create a new world or how to go about inhabiting that new world. So if the guiding question of ideology critique is Spinoza's question, like why do people fight for their slavery as if for their salvation, then I think the question for the critique of science is different. It's more like something like, what are the forms of intelligibility of systems of domination? And how do these forms of intelligibility function as justifications for resisting the emancipatory movements of the dominated? So Simon Clarke, I think, has made a related point. He said something very similar, I think. And Clarke wrote that Marx's critique of political economy does not create a space for a Marxist political economy, since political economy can never do more than describe the alienated forms of social existence. So I differ from Clarke in not finding much conceptual or political clarity in describing social relations in capitalism as alienated forms of social existence. I think it's better to say that social relations in capitalism, insofar as they're mediated by the market, are dominated forms of social existence. Being dominated means something particular. It means being exposed to a power that you cannot control, a power that can interfere in your life and upset your expectations at any time. Therefore, dominated agents, while they are not forced to act in any particular way, have strong incentives to study, anticipate, avoid, and cater to agents with dominating power. Because domination by the market is not domination by particular identifiable agents, but by anonymous masses of buyers and sellers whose aggregate acts can ruin me, it's no surprise, I think, that it is market-based capitalist societies that gave rise to the scientific study of what Hegel called in the philosophy of right, the mass relationships and mass movements in their qualitative and quantitative determinacy and complexity. And that's modern social sciences, right? Statistical sciences, political economy, economic science. The science of political economy, according to Hegel, and I think this is right, it produces knowledge, this is Hegel, knowledge of this shimmering of rationality within the sphere of need. And Hegel therefore says that it calls it a reconciling element within modern society. Marx's critique of political economy is supposed to, I think, undo this reconciliation by showing that the intelligibility of movements and relations of market-mediated society rest on the domination of the market-dependent producer in general and the wage market-dependent proletariat in particular. So that's the first sort of big conclusion that I want to draw from that. The second conclusion that I want to draw and in some ways this is obvious, so I don't really need the architecture in order to draw this conclusion, but we'll go there anyway. I think Marx's authority, insofar as he has any, does not arise from any experience of exploitation or domination, right? Marx is not an exploited worker. He's not drawing on experience in order to say, look, I've seen this, I've done this, this has happened to me. Rather, any claim to authority that he has comes from his claim to know the enemy, right? And more than this, I think we can go beyond that and say that I think capital is an attack on any would-be guides and leaders of the workers' movement who would claim authority on the basis of experience. And I think for this reason, it's no accident that Marxism opens up onto the Leninist question, right? Where does social democratic consciousness, that is the theoretical leadership of the movement, where does it come from? But it opens up onto this question, I think, not quite for the reason that Kautsky and Lenin thought. It doesn't open up onto this question because Marxism inherits and incorporates the history of bourgeois science, right? It's not that we have leadership of the movement because we have all of this scientific awareness. On the contrary, it's because Marxism could plausibly claim to have discovered the limits of bourgeois science. And I think in that vein, I think there's room for something like a general critical social science, one that identifies and studies any and all forms of domination on the model of capital. But I think that this could not be or even contain a critique of ideology. I don't think that's what's at stake at all. So going back to Geuss, because I think he's very clear on this, so Geuss claimed that the very heart of the critical theory of society is its criticism of ideology. Their ideology is what prevents the agents in society from correctly perceiving their true situation and real interests. I think this conception of the task of critique, I mean, on the one hand, I think it's just kind of, in the modern world, I think it's kind of bankrupt. I don't think ideology is the barrier to emancipation. But more apropos of our topic for this evening, what is more important right now is that I think it's foreign to Marx's Capital. I don't think that conception can draw any basis of authority from capital, which is not and does not contain, I think, a critique of ideology. So far from thinking that the proletariat is inhibited by ideology from its efforts at self-emancipation, I think Marx has complete faith, not only that human beings in general could devise and implement a global system of governance that both protects everyone from domination and is democratically accountable, but also that this global system would and could only emerge from the struggles of the dominated. I think Marx's faith in the masses was as close as he got to Dante's faith in God. So if we don't share that faith, if we don't share that confidence, then I don't think we have any warrant to base our pessimism in his capital. So that's the end of my prepared remarks, and then we can take this discussion wherever people want to go. Thank you.
Well, here's another moment for applause and a lot of gasps and wow and okay. Lots of controversial stuff, I think, to talk about. Thank you.
I think you said that I was supposed to take something that people thought about capital and disagree with it. So I tried to fit the brief.
This is where we're revaluing capital here as we speak, or whatever you want to call it. I appreciate it. So we'll open up the chat for questions. I want to encourage the students in the seminar to pose questions. We recently finished the book. You can call what we did that after a lot of work. So you should at least locate the expropriation of expropriators and be able to ask some questions about that. Maybe I'll start with a question, if you don't mind, Will. I want to, if you can give a little finer distinction between what Geuss and maybe even certain line of Frankfurt School readers of Marx or non-readers of Marx, inheritors of an idea of Marx, think of as the enlightenment of the people burdened with a dual consciousness or ideology. And what you're talking about, the kind of knowledge, because it still seems to be knowledge that the book is giving to the working class. On one hand, it seems to be that it is steering the mass readership away from its representation by metrical social science towards something else. So I understand that, but is it still a form of knowledge? And how is that supposed to work, that you open up this picture, you take them into hell, and then you move to almost automatically in that section. That's something that the students remarked on, and I think is right. And it's not, as you know, an imperative. It's kind of a fait accompli. The expropriators are expropriated, as though it happens magically. It's almost the same kind of magic that Geuss or Frankfurt School people think happen when you take ideology away, at least the way it's presented. So what is the difference in the kind of knowledge and the kind of change that happens in the mass from reading this book?
It's a great question, or complex of questions, I guess. So I guess what I want to, I think the classic place where people locate or try to locate a theory of ideology in Capital is in the discussion of fetishism. And they see in fetishism a sort of a false consciousness in which, and this has given birth to, I mean, this gets taken in a million different directions. But I think it's incredibly important that Marx never calls the fetishism of the commodities, or the fetish character of the commodities, he never calls it false or an illusion, right? It is, in fact, what you see is what you get. When you see that social relations are relations amongst things, that's because that's right. So to me, I think that the attempts to locate something like a false consciousness that fails our actual social experience, and that closes us off from an awareness of our true interests. I mean, I just think that's an alien problematic to what Marx is up to in the book, and that on the contrary, what he wants to do. Yeah. So you asked, what do we know from? We know a couple things. On the one hand, we know what political economy knows, right? In the sense that we know about the workings of the market, right? We know about how the circulation of commodities goes through. We know about, and so you get, to some extent, what Marx is doing in Capital is improving upon the Ricardian political economy of his time. So part of the work that he's doing is like really trying to reconstruct classical political economy and give the best version of political economy that he possibly can. But then we also know that what political economy in some sense can't know, which is that that the value in circulation can't possibly be grounded in the concrete labors of the workers. That there can't be a cycle of justice where everybody gets back everything that they have put in. So what you get is the blind spot of political economy as well, which is the blind spot both of the domination of producers by the market and the blind spot of exploitation of the workers in particular. So you definitely, like, Marx wants to teach you something. Like, I don't want to deny that. You absolutely come out of this with knowledge, but it's not, I don't think it is partly about, it's about knowing what the breakdowns of bourgeois political economy are. Like, where does it fall apart? Where does it fail?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a big topic and a lot of questions, but it's much clearer. Okay, we're ready to go to the chat. And forgive me if I missed you up above. So we'll start, and if you got missed, you can repost your question. I see a question by Tony Zanella. Can we open up the mic for Tony if you're willing to read your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So the question was whether you see any sort of direct connections between Republican elements in Dante and Marx's Republicanism. So one example I gave was like how Cato is elevated to the guardian of the purgatory instead of being consigned to hell. So that's it.
Uh-huh. I mean, this is not a question that I've actually explored. I don't know. Like, my feeling about Dante is that Dante doesn't care about freedom, especially. Like, Dante cares about faith and truth and beauty, and like, freedom is not a positive value necessarily for Dante, I think. So yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at this. I think what you point out is interesting. The elevation of Cato, that is interesting. But of course, Dante's a hardcore monarchist, and in fact, you know, in his book on monarchy, you know, proposes a global monarchy, you know, a global empire that would have a terrestrial and a spiritual side. So I'm open to, I love reading Dante, and I love like thinking about all of the crazy stuff that Dante's up to, because Dante is absolutely I mean, he's a canny and very intelligent political operative, as well as just being a great poet. But like I said, I haven't thought more about this.
Thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Tony. Okay, now we have a question from Sam Samore. Can we open up Sam's mic?
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Hello.
I got, at the end of your talk, I got a little lost on the bridge between, on the one hand, if you can't claim authority for leading the dominated masses via your experience as dominated, to Marx's absolute faith in the dominated in general to be the force of transformation. So I was wondering if you could just clarify the link there.
Yeah, fair enough. It was less of a bridge than like a Hail Mary pass or something like that. So so I guess what I wanted to what I wanted to at least gesture to are a couple different things. So on the one hand, the theoretical clarification that the workers' movement needed, Marx thought, was this sort of negative theory, right? In the sense that it's what the theory that they need is they do need an account of, they do need political economy. They do need to understand political economy, but they also need to see, as I said, they need to see the limits of political economy. And up to that point, up to the point of capital, Marx thought that, only Proudhon had really even tried to talk about political economy in an intelligent way or taken it seriously at all. And all he did was produce a bunch of unfortunately very Smithian peons to the beauty of change of commodities. So on the one hand, Marx thinks that the theoretical leadership that the workers' movement needs is this clarification of the stakes of political economy and a proper sort of destruction of political economy as a science. On the other hand, they that sets aside the question of political leadership, right? Political leadership may well come from experience, but the theoretical clarification is not going to come from any sort of experience of being exploited. It's not going to come from any sort of experience of being cheated in exchange, or from having to pay a high interest rate or something like that. That doesn't clarify the situation of the proletariat. It doesn't clarify how capitalism works or hangs together. It doesn't point to the limits of the capitalist mode of production at all. So that's the thing. I guess I want to separate out the sort of theoretical question, the theoretical leadership, and the political leadership question. And those, for Marx, those are just going to be very separate things. I think that's the upshot.
Thanks. That was really helpful.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel like there hasn't been a satisfactory answer to the question what Marx thought the book would do. There's that story that Zizek likes to quote, which is when La Commune was announced, Marx said, well, how could they do that? I haven't finished the book yet. So he had some sense this book was going to do something almost immediately. And you're approaching that. I think that's a really important question. And I myself totally agree that it's not to expose a secret only, or to blow off the illusion as though that would be enough. I want to, okay. I'm picking through the questions because I want to get ones that are really related to the talk first. Okay, how about we go to Sumanth Gopinath? Can we open Sumanth's mic?
Sure. I wasn't really making posing a question, but just saying that I when you were speaking, I thought of Balibar's argument in the philosophy of Marx that ideology is really a theory of the state. It came from an earlier period of Marx's work, and that fetishism is a theory of the market, and that these things are not equivalent. Maybe the question would be, what do you think of that argument? How do those things relate? There's certainly a lot of ideological bullshit in the tradition of political economy that can be unpacked, and Marx is very good at skewering that. And so, I don't know. I go back and forth on this question myself, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I mean, it's a great question. So, and it's definitely a question. The Little Balibar book was very important for me at one point, and I would probably need to go back to it with fresh eyes now and see what I think of it now. I think that general division of labor between ideology and fetishism is right, but I'm pretty skeptical that you can get much of a theory of ideology out of Marx at all, even in the early Marx. I mean, you have a few scattered comments about ideology hither and yon, and you don't really get anything like an attempt even to systematize them or anything like that. So my inclination is to say that Balibar is definitely onto something. The notion of ideology as the ideas of the ruling class does accord, I think, with Marx's earlier sort of concerns, where he was much more into the model of the French Revolution and just kind of pushing the French Revolution through to another level in Germany, and thinking that it would you just have to keep pushing the rock further and further. And in that context, that ideology seems like something like a public discourse of legitimacy that and set of categories for thinking about politics that emanate pretty straightforwardly from the official mouthpieces of the state. I mean, I think it's ironic because Marx was much more of a Habermasian in 1842 than he was later on, right? I mean, Marx spent a long while trying to basically bootstrap Germany into freedom via the creation of a public sphere, just on the back of, heroic journalists who wouldn't be silenced. And that it took him a while to leave that sort of set of concerns and strategies behind.
That's great.
That was kind of long-winded.
Well, I was just going to say political defeat of the 1848 revolutions probably has something to do with.
Yes, and political defeat preceded theoretical defeat, right? In the sense that, the political defeat of the defeat of the Rheinische Zeitung, the original one, definitely caused something of a break in how Marx thought about politics. That's when he just, discovers the proletariat. That's when he begins to put his hopes in the excluded, in the dominated, rather than in the enlightened. But I do think there are hangovers, theoretical hangovers of that political defeat that last for much longer, and absolutely the same is true of the defeat in 1848.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. We'll go to a kind of a technical question. Can we open up Gabby Nair? Gabby, are you willing to read your question?
Yeah, of course.
Hi.
So what do you make of the claim from Arthur, Smith, Royton, Murray, and the rest of the ISMT crowd that Marx is doing systematic dialectics? And how do you feel that this relates to your claims regarding domination?
Yeah, so I spent a while as a systematic dialectician. Around 2005, I was very into this, and absolutely, I think basically I think that entire group are engaged in a process of attempting to theoretically reconstruct the Marx's conception of capitalism as a dialectically interrelated whole. I mean, basically to take, to say that along the lines that Hegel's conception of absolute knowing is to historicize that and to say that's correct for the structure of capital as such, and that's that. I feel like there are too many mediations between that and the claims that I'm making to straightforwardly say what I think the connection is there, because in part Murray and Rutan and Arthur, like, they have a different problematic than me. They're treating Marx as a research program, although more along more Hegelian in its character than someone like Heinrich. I'm not, like, I think that's valuable. I think that can, like, I've learned a great deal about Marx's texts from those guys, but it always seems to me to be a fundamentally still fighting off the Ricardians, the Ricardian Marxists, still doing that sort of thing, and like, that's all great, and I'm totally on their side on that fight, but it's just not, I don't think it has an immediate relationship to anything like the political payoff or the political intervention of capital, and so I'm not really sure. And you can see that in the bracketing of the historical material when they try to reconstruct capital along those lines, I think.
Okay, Paul's system has apparently crashed, so I'm jumping in to moderate for a bit while he reboots. It seems as though there's really a lot of interest in this, understandably, in this interest about Marx and ideology, and what sort of critique is being developed in Capital. And so let's continue to discuss that for a bit. There are a number of questions on it. Patrick Coppola, would you like to read your question? Can we unmute Patrick? If not,
Hi.
Please.
Yeah, I think this isn't really a question either. I think just from the way that I'm approaching Marx and like being open to the way that other people approach Marx, I'm unclear on what you're trying to say about how critique functions in Marx because of what I think that means. I agree that if, like, I understand what you were saying by like a political critique of science, it's probably better characterized than that by, I forget what you contrasted that against, like the producing enlightenment and then shedding off ideology. But I've always linked critique to like this like thing that happens beginning with Kant that I see, because I'm approaching Marx more from like a philosophical background, where like a propedeutic gets like centered in philosophical method. So yeah, and I would agree that I've really paid attention to like the popularization of Marx's language, like the language in the Grundrisse, and a contribution to political economy. He's talking about all like universal this, particular that, like I don't know, like every other category it seems to, I forget if the language is like that in Capital, but and alienation is still a category used in those texts too. So yeah, I don't know if what I'm saying is clear. Sorry.
Well, I mean, you raised a few issues, so I don't know that I'll get to all of them, but I do think the connection to, the connection to the history of critique and the different ways in which critique gets used to entitle different projects. I mean, I think that's an interesting and a storied question. One that I wouldn't be able to do great justice to, but I do think there's a fairly straightforward way in which I think the critique of political economy is a critique in a sense that Kant could recognize, which is that part of what a critique, what the critique of pure reason does is what it does is it finds the proper domain of pure reason. That is, it defines it, right? It finds the places where the limits beyond which, if it goes, it produces monsters, right? So in some important sense, that's what Marx is doing as well with the critique of political economy, in that he's trying to define political economy, and that means to delimit it, right? To find its limits, to find the points beyond which it cannot go, and in that sense, to relativize it, to locate it in the sphere of history and knowledge. So I think that's fairly. I think you can say that, and I don't think that's super controversial. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, Alex Locasio, who is Michael Heinrich's really excellent translator, yeah. English translator, has a couple of questions, and let's give him a chance to ask one of them. They're both interesting questions, but we have a number to get to. So Alex, please pick one of your questions and ask it. Can we unmute him?
Alex, I don't know how to abolish the value form. I'm sorry. I assume that takes care of the other question.
Sorry, I just went to the bathroom, so I came late. Yeah, I wanted you to expand on your point that you've made in previous articles about Marx being closer to the marginal revolution in economics than classical political economy. In light of what Michael said a few weeks ago about, the speculation that if Marx had been confronted with the marginalist revolution, that he probably would have had great respect, for example, for its attempts at mathematical formalization.
So I think the only thing that I've committed myself to in print is that I think of Marx as much closer to the Austrians in general, but not necessarily to marginalism as such. So, and by that, I really mean that I think, and this comes out already in the book, it's not going to be a big shock to anybody, but I think that that in particular, Hayek's understanding of a market as an information sharing mechanism, as a place where you learn about society, and thinking of prices as signals. I think that is something that is very it's present in germ in Marx's discussion of fetishism. So that's the sort of thing that I'm thinking about. I agree with you that I think Marx was even undertaking some of the mathematical studies in order to, like, he had encountered a couple of the early articles of the Marginal Revolution, as I recall, and it's something that he would have, had he been healthy, I'm sure he would have taken to study. But I think the question of, getting away from the biographical, what would a confrontation between Marx's critique of political economy, and marginal utility theory, what would that look like? I think that's a very hard question to answer. I think, obviously, Simon Clark has taken a stab at that, which I think is a very admirable attempt in many regards. But that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question about the Russian translation, maybe switching things up a little bit. And the question is, I'm reading a message from Paul saying that his chat is now blank. He's back, but his chat is blank. So this question came from Sabo, and the question is, I'm gonna just unless I don't see Zabo in the chat at this point, so I'll just read it, which is and the question is that the Russian translation is important. Marx thought highly of it, and so why bring the French translation so much into play and not give the same kind of attention? I'm extrapolating a little bit to the Russian translation. And Will, I know you've thought a lot about the French translation. I mentioned that in the introduction. I mean, the obvious answer, I suppose, is that Marx basically did much of the French translation himself. And so, there are parts of it that function essentially as commentary on his work. He also, as we know, had a somewhat low opinion of the French intellectually, maybe. I mean, he, in his exchange with Engels, a well-known exchange about the French translation, he recycles some old German tropes about French culture and its strengths and its weaknesses, and
Yes.
Suggests there that he thinks that they need some help in understanding capital, and so that he's going to do some translating that's a mix, really, of translation and self-commentary. So, in any case, what are your thoughts on this?
No, it's a good question. So, part of this comes down to, what's your sense of Marx as a person, and how do you read his letters, for example? So some of these letters about certainly Marx was thrilled to have a Russian translation coming out, and he was very happy with that. I think that some of his, I don't talk about it, or I don't spend a lot of work on it, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, Paul, which is just that he had such a direct hand in the French translation. He did an immense amount of revising and retranslating that. So I think that's important to mention. And I think it makes the French translation much more, and at that point, Marx learned Russian, absolutely, and Marx, but Marx had known French for decades and had written in French and had worked in French, and I think his sense of what was going on in the French translation would have been just as good as his sense of what was going on in the German original edition. And I think that matters. I think that the two German editions and the French edition stand together as the ones that I think we can attribute to Marx himself. Whereas the Russian translation has to have just a bit more distance from Marx's own hand, but that's all.
I mean, I would say that any good translation is going to help you, is going to be an interesting, fruitful take on the work. But the question is, from a kind of philological perspective, which do you want to use to help clarify certain terms, or thinking in that way about bringing in the French tradition. And that's, long been an aim of translators of capital. And one of the things that Fawkes has taken a lot of heat for is not making good on his commitment to integrating the French tradition, the French edition, excuse me, into his translation, either citing moments where the French tradition, what I keep saying tradition when I mean edition, excuse me, the French edition is quite different, and it does again function sort of as commentary, or just not taking it into account seemingly when he translated the text. And there's an interesting history, if I may continue in this vein for a moment, among Marx translators of not doing what they say they're going to do. To an extent, it goes back to Engels. And if you read his long epistolary statements about what should be done in a Marx translation, and then you look at the edition of Capital that he basically oversaw, you see some pretty striking disparities. But I am going to move on now to another question. I'm gaining rapidly a greater and greater appreciation for Paul North, whom I already appreciated immensely. But I appreciate now his ability to do this moderation on the fly. So Philip Wohlstetter, I don't know, it's a German name if you pronounce it with a German pronunciation, or if it's Wohlstetter or Wohlstetter. In any case, Philip, would you like to read your question? Can we unmute Philip, please?
Sure. You can pronounce it either way if you like. The question really is how people have taken both, quote, economics or true economics and a critique of political economy, which is the critique of the categories of bourgeois economy. And I'm wondering how one can avoid mixing them up and glomming together. I know when Will is talking about Marx is close to the Austrians and so forth, I'm sort of trying to think, it's obvious that there are different levels in the text, particularly between 1 and volume 3 and all the attempts at mathematics at the time. But it leads to a larger question of how does one sync the critique of political economy and the categories, which is utterly valid still and tells us more about the roots of how capitalism operates than any other social theory of capitalism, and what can be salvageable from a discipline that's called economics at the moment. So I don't know if that's coherent at all, but that would be my question.
No, I think one of the big questions, and this is sort of, I mean, it was raised by Alex's question about marginalism, but it goes beyond that as well. But I think there is a real question about whether, to what extent would a critique of economics, a critique of contemporary economics, if Marx, a Marx-like project were to get off the ground today, what would it have to look like? I mean, there was certainly there's a long tradition of Marxists trying to sort of shoehorn later developments in economics into Marx's critique, to basically find ways of, building a little shanty off the side and putting any new economics in there. And I think it's always a valid question to ask, is that actually a legitimate procedure anymore? I mean, I think one of the dangers of Marx's procedure is that, like, the political critique of science can be done well and it can be done badly. And certainly, I think that there are plenty of people both on the left and in particular who, from a Marxist background, who are, too dismissive of contemporary social science work, like in the name of historical concreteness, or in the name of following the movement, or things like that. I think it's at least I think it's always a live question and a legitimate one to ask. Do we have a critique of contemporary social sciences that matches the critique of political economy? And it's not obvious to me that we do.
Thank you.
Writer, I'm going to let you continue to ask questions because having got kicked out, my chat got totally evacuated. But there was a question that got reposted that was earlier and I missed. So maybe we could just ask, open up the mic of Scott Rittner to not skip him again. Can we open Scott's mic? Scott, are you there?
I am here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Will, so much for your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned right at the end of your talk a comment about.
I'm sorry, Scott. I hate to say this, but I've been interrupted on my end for just 1 second. Can I just take a pause?
Sure.
Can you take that back to Simon? No, I'm in the middle of something, baby.
I love this. It really is the thing that we all hide when we go into the institution is all of the thing that goes behind all of our work, all of our family obligations.
Exactly.
Here we get to see
That's
it.
right. That's
real.
right.
It's
That's
there.
right.
Real conditions of our intellectual production.
The
we're no
eruption
longer
of the real.
Okay.
Will, is that the famous
Okay, Scott,
outgoing
sorry, where were
7-year-old?
you?
Yeah, is that the
Yes,
famous
exactly.
outgoing 7-year-old?
It's the very famous 7-year-old. That's right.
Thanks. You mentioned just at the very end of your talk, and it was almost kind of a throwaway comment, but I have to ask about it, that you find no basis for pessimism in Capital. But I want to challenge you on that a little bit, right? To ask if Marx's analysis, especially in his more historical chapters, is correct, wouldn't it require sort of concerted pessimistic action to affect change in the world rather than optimistic philosophical interpretation?
Pessimistic action. I guess, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'll just try to clarify what I meant by pessimism. And then you can tell me whether or not that runs up against what you were trying to say, which is, so I guess it's no surprise to me that 20th century critical theorists would be extremely pessimistic. They would be pessimistic on the basis of real historical experience. They would be pessimistic on the basis not only of the failure of the revolution in Germany, not only on the basis of the experience of Nazism and fascism, not only on the experience of the failures of the dreams of what the Soviet Revolution would deliver. There were many, many, many reasons to be pessimistic in 1930, in 1940, in 1950, in 1960. So it's no surprise that folks would be pessimistic. I think it's an interesting question to ask whether I mean, I guess it's an interesting question to ask whether that pessimism, that justifiable pessimism, that reasonable pessimism is then a retroactive criticism of Marx for his lack of pessimism, or whether it is a in part a result of the expectations of revolution changing between 1870-ish and 1930-ish. And my suspicion is that to some extent it's both. I think that the experience already of the commune ought to, and it did, it gave lots of people, good basis for, much more pessimistic accounts of what the possibilities for working class revolution were in Europe, and how quickly things were going to go, as well as and that doesn't even take into account experiences in Britain and so forth. So I guess there's just a huge field of exploration and questioning there. I don't think that political action is necessarily allied with pessimism, nor do I think that theory is necessarily allied with optimism. So I guess that's part of the reason for my hesitation about the question.
Yeah, thanks. I think that you and I are on the same page, at least in the first part of your answer. I didn't mean to imply that theory is aligned with optimism. Someone in the chat, mentioned that Adorno had entered the room, but in any case, yeah, I think that we largely agree upon that. I guess my question more was about thinking about like the idea within perhaps the section on so-called primitive accumulation, right? The continuation of primitive accumulation or so-called primitive accumulation, even after the sort of taking hold of capital as an international system of totality, et cetera, right? And the sort of struggles against that, which may or may not turn out the way we desire them to, I think is more along the lines of what I was thinking in terms of pessimism. But I think you and I are more or less on the same page. Thank you.
Okay. I'll read it for him. What are important differences between Marx's thought and that of Republicanism, even in its most radical forms? I'm pushing you intentionally to show us what is at stake if we don't go in the Republican direction. Good to see you, Will. So I guess Igor, maybe?
Only from online, that's the unreal world. So it's a good question. I mean, I think the line of demarcation, I guess there are two lines of demarcation that I would draw between Marx and the Republican tradition broadly construed. The first, I think, is Marx's understanding of fetishism. I think his understanding of the impersonal domination of the market is something that is, a complete conceptual innovation within the field of Republican theory, and it really does scramble some of the terms of Republicanism, because Republicanism historically and contemporarily is worried about the Lord that you can see, not about the one you can't. And so the institutions of Republicanism are all built with around the idea of protecting people from personal domination, and that means personal dependency to some extent, right? And so they, and that is the other side. The other side is that without that analysis of the market as dominating, it's really hard to universalize Republicanism as a theory of equal liberty for all, because the liberty that was traditionally conceived of by Republicans as non-domination, as freedom from the arbitrary will of another, really hinged on having a place to go to be independent, having a private sphere to retreat into that would give you an independent basis in the world, right? And so you get something like this in Arendt, right? You get an attempt to update republicanism for the contemporary world, and what that really amounts to is a denigration and refusal of society, and a real failure to grapple with the market. So I think when you bring the market in and you try to understand the market as itself a form of domination, then that, I mean, it really causes havoc for a lot of the other categories of other Republicans. I mean, I think that means that the political institutions of Marxian communism, you know, they clearly have Republican inspiration. And that's true, you know, you get it in Lenin too, whatever, it just rolls on down, right? Like you get, you know, the you know, arming the people and large deliberative assemblies and recall of legislators, right? Like these are pretty classic things. But I think it is true that that is in some sense a failure of Marxists to really grapple with how much the theoretical innovation and what sort of impacts that would have on the need for new political institutions. And I think that's just an unsolved problem in the history of Marxism.
Okay, we're going to wind things down now. And so here is one of the final questions. This question is there's buzz about this question in the chat. This is from Raphael Turayan. Sorry, I missed that one not so badly. But Raphael, would you like to read your question, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Will, first of all, thank you for taking the time to join us. This is a great conversation. I wanted to pose this question of coming back to what you mentioned about the idea of critical social science, or critical social science as an emancipatory project. And to what extent is that related to the critique of the state that Marx intended to make a volume of capital or dedicate a volume of capital to, but never got around to doing it? And I think in the sense that so much of the later history of Marxist theory and practice can be understood as a way of trying to fill in those gaps or those lacunae of what Marx left unsaid about political power and how to approach it. That I think, what does this omission itself tell us about the relationship between state power and political economy?
Right. That's a great question, Raphael. So, I mean, first to Marx's intentions. I mean, Marx intended this, Marx intended that, Marx intended everything. He made plans for every eventuality. And I think that, I think a lot of his plans were pretty cheap, right? They were like, oh, I'm really interested in this. I'm going to write it down as something I want to tackle at some point or another. I mean, my own sense from having you know, tried to work through all of this is that the closest that Marx actually gets is the section on primitive accumulation at the end of Capital, and that attempt to think through the state as you know, what I call the violent and armed servant of capital, I think I think there's a lot of potential in that conception of the state as dependent on capital accumulation, and as you know, attempting to create the conditions for capital accumulation. I think I think that has promise, but it's just a hint of what of the work that would need to be done. And trying to bring, you know, the sort of traditional conception of the state as armed bands of men, right? Trying to bring the treatment of the repressive state apparatuses into a discussion of the reliance of the state on debt financing and the reliance of the state on tax financing, and the rough interactions between the armed apparatuses of the state and the financial dependence of the state on capital accumulation. That's all that is, I mean, it's just a blank spot for an immense amount of work to be done that Marx certainly did not do for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This does seem like a good moment to pause, Paul. So we're going to thank Professor Roberts for his talk and his immensely generous gift of his time and intelligence and conversation. So thank you again, a moment of great applause. You can't hear it, but it's going on. You can see it. We thank you. We're trying to think through this book and you really pushed us hard. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.
I don't usually give a plug for the next talk, but it happens to be tomorrow. So we have a double header this week. If you want to hear Karen Ng on the question of human being in Marx, you can tune back in tomorrow night at 6. We also have a talk next week, I believe, as well. So we're piling these on. Thank you all for attending, and we'll let you go now until the next time. Thanks.